Imagine a gloomy evening when a chance encounter turns into a real nightmare. A white man, driven by inexplicable anger and rash actions, suddenly makes a fatal mistake. He hits a dark-skinned girl with a bottle of vodka, completely unaware of who her father is. At that moment, no one realizes what consequences are ahead of him. But before we tell you what happened next, let's get to know each other. Write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching this video from. We look forward to each and every one of your posts. After all, each of you, each viewer is incredibly important to us. You are not just viewers, you are a part of our channel, and it is thanks to you that our stories become alive. By supporting us, you help us promote our channel, and we want you to know how much we appreciate each and every one of you. So, friends, don't be shy. Write a few words about yourself because you are incredibly important to us. It was an ordinary night in a small bar on the outskirts of the city where people came to forget the noise and carelessness for a while. The crowd laughed, glasses clinked, the smell of alcohol and smoke lingered in the air, and everything seemed insignificant. But the moment she walked in, something changed in the air. She stood out, a dark-skinned girl with a proud posture and a confident look, her smile causing dislike in some hidden, barely perceptible but palpable. Sitting behind the counter, Tom, a white man with rough features, tensed involuntarily when he saw her. He couldn't explain to himself why her presence was causing him such a storm of feelings, a mixture of irritation and incomprehensible hatred that boiled up in him with every step she took. Suddenly, it seemed to him that the whole bar was looking at her, as if her presence here were breaking some unspoken order. What is she doing here? He thought, and a shadow of contempt flickered in his gaze. It seemed to him that her cheerful and liberated demeanor was a personal affront, as if she had come here to challenge his world, his rules. Tom wasn't used to anyone being different or conspicuous, especially if that someone was a dark-skinned girl, boldly and confidently interacting with the people around her. Every smile, every gesture was getting on his nerves more and more. There was a grin on his face, cold and evil, that seemed to say that he despised her. He couldn't take his eyes off her, and the gaze grew darker and harder. The man couldn't contain himself. With every glance the girl threw in his direction, resentment, anger, and something else boiled up in him. Dark, unseemly, long hidden inside, but ready to burst out. She did nothing to provoke him, just sat with her friends, laughing and chatting, occasionally throwing fleeting glances in his direction. But every glance, every smile, every gesture seemed to mock him, increasing his irritation. It seemed to him that she was defiantly challenging everything he considered his own. Finally, Tom couldn't stand it any longer and walked over to her table. His gaze was icy and his voice was cold, but there was anger underneath. He said something sarcastic, caustic, trying to hurt her. The girl, unaccustomed to such treatment, responded calmly at first, but her eyes flashed with indignation, which only made his anger grow. She wasn't going to give in or bow to his aggression, which further fueled his irritation. Word by word, their voices began to rise. Tom felt obliged to suppress her, to put her in her place, to show her that she was a stranger here, that her merriment was not her right. He tried to humiliate her, using caustic words to emphasize the difference between them, his feigned superiority, her inappropriateness in this place, he assumed. People began to notice the conflict, but no one intervened. His angry words came at her like blows, but the girl continued to hold her ground, defending her dignity, which infuriated him. And then, at the moment when his patience finally broke, he grabbed a bottle of vodka from the counter and, lifting it, stepped forward. His eyes burned with blinding contempt mixed with anger. He didn't think about what he was doing. He was blinded by hatred. He felt he had to put her in her place at any cost. An instant later, the bottle came down sharply, aiming straight for her head, and there was a deafening crack of glass all around. The moment the bottle crashed down on her head, everything in the bar seemed to freeze. A muffled thud cut through the air, and shards of glass flew apart, some of the tiny pieces smashing into her skin, leaving thin, barely noticeable cuts. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her head, trying to realize what had just happened. Her eyes blurred from the sharp pain and shock, and warm blood trickled down her fingers, mixing with the tears she couldn't hold back. Tom looked down at her with a satisfied, almost triumphant grin. It seemed to him that he had shown her her place, proved to her that she didn't belong here, that he was powerful and she was just an outsider who had no right to defy him. In his eyes, she was nothing more than a nuisance to be removed because, in his opinion, she had overstepped her bounds by allowing herself to be confident and happy around him. He stood over her like a hero, waiting for this humiliation to silence her, to crush her to the end. The people gathered around her looked at the girl lying on the floor, then at the man, and their gazes were filled with condemnation mixed with fear, but no one made a move to help. She lay on the cold floor, feeling the shame and humiliation roll in along with the pain. To her, this blow was not just a physical insult, but the epitome of all the hatred, prejudice, racism she'd had to deal with all her life. But never before had they manifested themselves so vividly, so cruelly, and inhumanely. The crowd was frozen, as if chained to the spot, surrounding the girl lying on the floor and the man who didn't seem to be remorseful for his act. The gazes of the bar guests were fixed on her, some with judgment, others with indifference, and some reflecting a fear that prevented them from intervening. The silence was deafening. No one took a step forward to help, as if an invisible barrier separated them from the scene, keeping them in the shadow of indifference. Some averted their eyes as if convincing themselves that it did not concern them, that what was happening was nothing more than an episode between the wrong people. It was easier for them to think that the girl had brought this humiliation upon herself by her presence, by her defiant behavior. The stares around them revealed hidden prejudices in an instant. Many of those who in ordinary circumstances might have defended the victim now found her race and appearance an excuse for what had happened. There was tension in the air, but no one dared to break it. There was something heavy in their silence, as if fear of the consequences held them in place. They feared not for her, but for themselves, afraid of being drawn into a conflict with a man whose rage could easily turn on anyone who stood up for the uninvited guest. The thought flashed through their heads that interference might cost them something more than this chance encounter. The girl was left alone, cut off from any possible support. Her eyes darted around, searching for a single sympathetic face, but only encountered cold stares or downcast eyes. She was surrounded, but left alone with pain, humiliation, and fear. Her silent cry was stuck in the air, disappearing into the dark silence behind centuries of prejudice, indifference, and tacit approval. As the silence in the bar became almost palpable, Tom felt a heavy feeling grow inside him, a mixture of fear and anxiety that he had never expected to experience. A moment ago, he had been blinded by rage and confidence in his right to put her in her place. But now, standing over the girl who was still lying on the floor, he began to realize that he had gone too far. At first, he tried to suppress that fear, convincing himself that he had done the right thing, that this was a well-deserved lesson. But the surrounding stares he finally began to notice were burning his back. They didn't contain the support or approval he had so desperately sought in the heat of anger. Instead, he saw judgment, horror, and even disgust. It seemed to him that this humiliation, her humiliation, had become his own. The thought of the consequences suddenly flashed through his mind, making him go cold. He knew he'd made a terrible mistake, and fear of retribution began to clench his chest. Perhaps someone would file a complaint against her. Perhaps the witnesses would be against him. The thought surfaced that there might be people in town who wouldn't tolerate being treated this way, especially if they knew who had suffered at his hands. His confidence melted, and in its place came a realization of vulnerability. He remembered the stories of people who had paid a high price for their reckless racism and cruelty. Thoughts of possible revenge or justice, which now seemed inevitable, made his heart clench with fear. Tom took a step back, his face pale, and finally his gaze met the girl's eyes, which looked at him with such pain and contempt that he felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. Her gaze was full of mute menace, reminding him that this act would not be without consequences. The next day, Tom awoke with a heavy feeling of a black shadow hanging over him. He couldn't get rid of the picture of last night's incident, which came back to him again and again. His phone was ringing off the hook. Friends and acquaintances who were at the bar were rushing to find out what had happened. But among the many messages, there was one that stood out from the rest, one name that made him go cold: Jonathan Blaine. Jonathan Blaine was not just a man. He was a name that everyone in the city knew. A businessman associated with many successful projects, a philanthropist supporting dozens of social initiatives, and one of the most influential people in the district. He knew how to turn laws and people to his liking. A man with a reputation for iron will and a firm hand, he did not tolerate anyone daring to go against him or his family. He had the kind of authority that put people in awe, not by shouting loudly, but by making people mute at the mere sight of him. When Tom realized that the girl at the bar was his daughter, a cold sweat ran down his back. He'd heard of Jonathan Blaine, knew he was not to be trifled with. People whispered that to quarrel with the man was to sign one's own doom. He had a reputation for defending his own, and he did it brutally, without hesitation or regret. Tom had barely had time to realize that he was in this man's path when a call came to him. The voice on the other end of the line was calm and cold, but there was a sense of danger behind that calm politeness. The voice introduced itself as Jonathan Blaine's assistant and informed him that Mr. Blaine would like to speak with him. There was no threat in those words, just a polite invitation that left no room for refusal. Now it was clear to Tom. He had crossed the path of the man everyone feared. When Tom entered the office, he was met by Jonathan Blaine's assistant, who discreetly pointed him to the chair across from the massive desk where Blaine sat. The room seemed a few degrees colder to Tom, and he couldn't take his eyes off Jonathan's stern face. There was something in Blaine's eyes that took his breath away, an icy determination that masked an almost tangible power. Blaine was silent for several long seconds, letting Tom feel the full force of his gaze. Then he said quietly, "You know who I am, and you probably understand why you're here." Tom nodded convulsively, trying to hold back the shiver that swept through his body. "My daughter," Blaine continued, "you humiliated not only as a human being, but as a member of my family, and you will answer for that." He did not threaten with loud words, nor did he raise his voice. There was no anger or cruelty in his speech, but his calm tone made Tom feel even more afraid. Before he realized what was happening, Blaine was recounting the events that had begun to unfold in his life since that night. The first to disappear was his business. Literally, the day after he met Blaine, his partners started canceling their contracts one by one. Rumors spread quickly. Tom is toxic. He's not safe to work with. His accounts were blocked. His credit was cut off. All those who had once supported him now easily turned their backs on him. Then came the trouble with the law. They started digging into his past, and things came up that Tom had long forgotten about. Old tax debts, mistakes in documentation, illegal transactions that once seemed insignificant. Now fines and lawsuits were piling up, and he realized he could soon lose everything he'd ever held dear. But the punishment didn't end there. Blaine decided to destroy his reputation on a personal level. It became unbearable for Tom to go out on the street. In the eyes of passers-by, he saw condemnation, and in the press and social networks, his name was now associated with labels that he would never be able to erase. Tom tried to fight, but every day he realized more and more that his life was under the control of one man, Jonathan Blaine. And with each day lost, with each new aspect of his life destroyed, he began to realize the true meaning of punishment. It was not just vengeance, but the complete destruction of everything that had ever made up his life. He found himself a nobody, with a devastated soul, a lost existence, forced to recognize that you have to pay the full price for your actions when you're opposed by a man who can teach you a lesson in cruel, cold justice. With each passing day, Tom felt his world crumbling around him like a house of cards that had finally collapsed under the weight of his own actions. His once tight-knit circle of friends, partners, and acquaintances who had always supported him now evaporated. Those who used to walk into the halls and bars with him by the hand now avoided crossing paths with him, as if his name had become a stain that could be picked up with a single touch. Tom tried to contact his old friends, hoping for some kind of support, but there was only deafening silence, and those who did answer said the same thing. "I'm sorry, but we have our own things to do. We can't help you anymore." There was more pain in those words than in all the blows he had ever had to take. Everyone who he thought would be with him to the end had turned away from him, and it was a personal disaster for him. His pride, once unshakable, began to turn into a dragging, poisonous shame. He couldn't look people in the eye, feeling his gaze go blank, and every step he took became heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of all his mistakes on his shoulders. Everywhere he went, he felt judgment. People whispered behind his back, and his name became an occasion for ridicule and contemptuous talk. The career he had once been so proud of was destroyed. People began to say that Tom was a man who was scary to even approach, much less do business with. All the small successes he had spent years building turned to ashes. He realized that he had become a symbol of the fall, an example of how you can lose everything with one single act. Blaine had gotten what he wanted. His punishment left Tom feeling nothing but humiliation. He felt small and helpless, like a hunted animal that had lost its power and pride. His world was now confined to the cramped, empty apartment and the oppressive silence that was his constant companion. Every day was now an unbearable reminder of his mistake, of the cruelty he had once considered a show of strength. Everything he had done that night came back to him now, but with even greater force, as if fate had decided to teach him a lesson in the same form in which he had humiliated and abused. His life had become a mirror image of his own actions, fierce, unscrupulous, and ruthless. Rumors of what happened to him spread beyond his town. The story of a man who allowed himself a racist attack on a girl and was then destroyed by her powerful father became an example for others. News sites and social media sites were rife with articles and comments. His name became a shameful symbol, and people discussed his downfall with undisguised schadenfreude and pleasure. Tom saw all those comments, humiliating, cruel, and each one of them hurt him like hundreds of small shards of a broken bottle smashing into his skin. But the real payback came later. One of his former business partners, with whom Tom had once been particularly cruel and arrogant, took advantage of his downfall to crush him completely. In a business community where Tom had once been secure in his position, he was now rejected and despised, and his former partner took his place, taking away everything Tom had long sought without a shadow of regret. Tom found himself alone with his fears and bitterness. Every time he remembered the face of the girl he had struck that fateful night, he felt shame and despair overwhelm him. That face, his act, the consequences. They haunted him in the silence of his apartment, in the reflection of his mirror, in the silent nights when he couldn't sleep. His world had shrunk to the size of a small room, where every object reminded him that he had once been someone, but was now a nobody. He realized that the payback for his racism, his cruelty and injustice was not simply the loss of material goods. The real punishment is the feeling of emptiness, loss, and the impossibility of regaining the lost respect for oneself. In recent months, Tom had been living in a fog. His pride, his confidence, his reputation, everything he had once held dear had crumbled like sand through his fingers. Every day he felt the consequences of the fatal mistake he had made because of his prejudice, his hatred, and his unconscious fear of someone he didn't understand. Stripped of everything, he finally began to understand, to realize that it wasn't the girl who had ruined him, but his own cruelty and arrogance that had made him blind and vulnerable. Tom realized now that in her calm, confident gaze, which had irritated him so much at the time, there was a strength he had never imagined. That strength was not in her father's influence, but in herself, her ability to hold herself with pride and dignity, in spite of the judgment he and others like him sought to impose on her. She possessed something he had never had, an inner fortitude that made her indestructible in the face of prejudice. He realized now that she had never been weak or vulnerable, as he had imagined at the time. This lesson was Tom's greatest punishment and most painful revelation. He realized that people were not as simple as he had thought, that there were worlds behind appearance, race, and all differences, and that power was not always expressed in loud words or physical authority. He remembered her face, calm and confident, and finally recognized it for himself. She was stronger than he had ever imagined, because her strength came from the depths of her personality, from her resilience in the face of prejudice and injustice. Since then, his life had changed forever. He no longer felt entitled to judge others by their appearance or position. The story that began with his haughty look ended with the full realization that true power is always hidden deeper than can be seen with the eyes. Friends, this story is a reminder of how important it is to see people for who they are and not through the prism of stereotypes. Write in the comments what you think about what happened. Have you ever experienced bias or racism in your life? How did you deal with it? Each and every one of you is very important to us, and we incredibly appreciate your support. Your comments, likes, and subscriptions help us tell more of these stories and share important topics. Subscribe to our channel. Give us a like if you liked it. And of course, stay tuned. We wish you a good day, and remember, every one of you matters.